Hello to all of our listeners. My name is Tofay, and today is another great day to be a social worker. Welcome to Social Work Amplified, a podcast hosted by Speak. Speak stands for social policy, education, advocacy, and knowledge. And our mission is to amplify the voices of social workers by providing resources, increasing students' political engagement, and facilitating networking opportunities. Speak would like to gratefully acknowledge the generous support of the Simmons Sister Fund at Texas Women's Foundation. I would like to introduce our guest for today's podcast, Kerrie Judice.
Hi, Tofay. So thankful that you guys have me today. And just for those watching, I promise we did not actually coordinate the red, but it worked out. So.
Awesome. Kerrie is a licensed master social worker and is the CPS Research and Policy Analyst for TexProtects. She has dedicated her career to advocating for children and families in various roles, including working for Child Protective Services for 8 years. Kerrie has grown more passionate over time about advocating for children and families to have a healthy and positive future. After working at CPS, she worked on juvenile justice policies at Texas Criminal Justice Coalition and later worked in the Senate during the 86th legislative session on a child welfare reform. She aspires to use these experiences in her current role to advance policies that will further ensure children's safety and well-being. Kerrie received her Master's of Science in Social Work from the University of Texas at Austin and a Bachelor's of Social Work from Lombard University in Beaumont. Kerrie, you've done so many things. I'm so excited to get to know you today and just kind of like pick your brain. Of course. So we're going to go into the first question. What led you into obtaining a Master's in Social Work? I saw that you already had a Bachelor's in Social Work, but what made you take that next step to get a master's degree?
So, having my bachelor's in social work, already knowing the values of social work, that just seemed like a natural next step for me. But honestly, the biggest piece was whenever I was working with families at CPS, I really had seen where like policies and laws were putting up red tape for families that I was working with. And so I just knew things needed to be changed at that systems level. And so all I really knew at that point was I need to go back to school. I need to figure out how to do this and how to do this well for families at that kind of next level. So the master's in social work was, like I said, kind of that natural next step for me so that I could advocate for families at that larger scale.
Awesome. So that master's degree kind of like empowered you to fulfill your desires that you wanted for the families and children. That's really great. So what made you decide that right now you're working with TexProtects? And I know that you've worked at the CPS level, so you've worked at the micro level, but right now you're working at the macro level. And what made you decide that you want to concentrate in the macro level within political social work and advocacy?
So I'm going to tell you all a little story that I've told some people along the way. Honestly, whenever I started out as that baby social worker, I honestly thought direct practice was going to be my career. Honestly, I had kind of aspired. I was like, oh man, I'm going to become a therapist, the whole thing, that whole clinical route. So had you asked me even just 10 years ago, I would not have had macro social work on my radar, other than my mentor and professor from undergrad who swore I was going to go into policy. And so he was right. But, honestly, it just, I learned all too well at CPS that it's policies and laws that shape practice. And so after grad school, like you said in my intro, I was able to work in the Senate, and I was able to actually kind of be the person in the ear of that senator and putting people in front of him. That was the most important to me, was that he was hearing from people that were impacted. And so that was just a role I wanted to play. I wanted to facilitate that relationship and facilitate that exchange of knowledge. And then obviously now in my role at TexProtects, the legislative advocacy is really just one piece of what I do. I get to be the one who's researching and figuring out what best practices are and putting those forward to the state agencies that we work with, but also at the legislative level so that we can hopefully change laws to better impact families and set them up for success. So, it's just been quite the journey for me. Like I said, had you met me 10 years ago, the political side of things would not have been anywhere on my radar. But now that I'm doing this, I absolutely love it.
That's cool. I love how the field of social work just kind of gives us that that opportunity to just, be diverse in what we do. Like, even if we start off with the micro social work, we don't have to end up there. And I really love the part of your story where, you said your professor like saw the fact that you will work in policy, although you didn't see that in yourself. So I think that like a lot of students are like that. We may not see it in ourselves, but like that passion is going to drive us to work in the macro field, which we can make, a greater impact, or like, impact populations a little bit more. So can you tell us about your organization that you work for, TexProtects? What is it all about?
Okay, so we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan advocacy organization. So we're actually the Texas chapter of Prevent Child Abuse America. So we really advocate for smart strategies all along the prevention spectrum. And there's a reason I'm saying all along the prevention spectrum. I think, it's easy for us to kind of think of prevention, especially when it comes to child protection, is like, okay, how can we prevent child abuse and neglect from ever happening? And that is absolutely something that we advocate for, is more along that kind of upstream prevention strategy. But again, like prevention is a spectrum. We want to make sure that if child abuse or neglect has happened, that it doesn't happen again. So we really want to prevent recurrence. We also want to advocate for policies to make sure that kids in care are safe. So really kind of at each kind of intervention point with families, that's what we're advocating for. And I just love this organization because, again, as somebody that worked at CPS, I always saw the reactive side of things. And so, to me, it was always like, what are we doing proactively? So I just love that TexProtects has that focus. Now, granted, I'm the one in the organization that kind of focuses more downstream, but I just love that full focus on the prevention spectrum of things for families.
Awesome. That prevention. I really like when you said prevention is a spectrum, because just because maybe we may fail, as a nation to prevent child abuse or child neglect the first time, but we don't have to give up. We can still implement and incorporate prevention at the next level of the process. And I really like that. So for upcoming social work students that might be interested in a position like yours, can you provide a brief insight into what you do overall, or what a day looks like for you?
Yeah, no 2 days are alike. I think that you can technically say that about any social work position, right? Because we're dealing with humans on some sort of level, right? And so there's just not a predictability to it. But I mean, to kind of break things down, I would say a big piece of my job is just being in the know, like knowing what's going on politically, because that absolutely drives our strategy, knowing what's going on the ground. So that means working with our partners that are, providing services, hearing from them, like what's happening, what's going on, what are the gaps, like what can we be doing on a policy level to kind of help you serve families better, that kind of thing. And so I would say a big piece of that is just being in the know, and then with that is education. Education is such a big piece of my job and something that I've really found out that I love doing. And so, the education piece, I think it's kind of, I don't think I'm saying anything here that hasn't been said before, but CPS is a beast of a system. There's so many moving parts. It's just so large. There's so many people within the system. They're serving families at all kinds of levels. And so, I think sometimes whether we're talking to lawmakers or just the lay person that just doesn't understand the system, sometimes we need to break that down. And then obviously another piece of my work is, researching. It's figuring out, okay, what are the best practices? What are other states doing that's been successful? And so all of these are kind of components. And then obviously there's the partnership and collaboration. And so it all kind of, there's little bits and pieces of that every day. So if you're the kind of person that, just likes to be able to kind of dabble in a lot of different things, I would say, coming in, as a social worker on the policy side of things, you'll absolutely be fulfilled in that area. So
That's cool. It seems like you do, a variety of things each day. And just while I was reading your biography and just looking at your resume, I asked myself, I was like, what drives your passion with working with the population, which is children and family that you work with? Because I know a lot of people like yourself, they start off in CPS and they see the reality of, working with children and families, and they get disappointed or discouraged, or they get like taxed out and they, just end up leaving that population. So what drives your passion? Because I know that you kind of, your whole social work career, you continuously work with children and family. So what's that thing that drives your passion?
Well, so I feel like I even want to back up here because, I'm pretty sure nobody just wakes up with that dream as a little girl going like, I want to be a CPS worker whenever I grow up. I don't think necessarily anybody's thinking of that when they're, little, but, honestly, for me, it started with just what I knew is I wanted to work with children and families on some level. And then obviously getting in on the ground level and working with families individually. And like I said, just kind of seeing how the system, I don't want to say worked against families, but there were barriers. There were things in place that I was going, man, like, how can I remove this for this family? There's this red tape. And honestly, just like I said, there was a piece of me when I saw the success of kids going home, when I did see those success stories, I'm like, I want to see more of that on a grander level. Right. And so to me, just knowing that things happen, that things trickle down, the systems level was really kind of pulling me. And so, I think that's a lot of it is just, like I said, in the beginning, it was just this passion to go like, I want to work with children and families. And that continued to grow as I did work with them individually. And so another thing I would say too is for anybody who is interested in child protection, just know once it's in your blood, it's there. I've told people like you saw in part of my biography that I went and did a little bit of juvenile justice policy. It's not too far of a stretch from what I've done, but I came back. And so I do think once you kind of get into child protection, it just sticks with you. So.
Oh, that's really great. And you've also worked with a lot of, policy. You've worked like in one of the legislative sessions. So can you give us insight? What does policy creation or policy making, what does that look like?
Oh, goodness. So yeah, I've seen it from both sides. First in the Senate, I was the person going to others saying, okay, I know this is a problem. What do you see as solutions? And then now I'm on this side of it, trying to come up with the solutions with those that are impacted, with those that are on the ground. So, honestly, it's, a big piece of it, like I said, is the research. Do we have the backing of the data? That's so important to be able to say like, hey, we know like using this information, we know that this is the issue and we've seen either this work or this work and these are the results. That's a really big piece of it. But, a lot of this work is very collaborative. And so, even whenever I was in the Senate, oftentimes seeing how people work together, knowing that it's not just one person's ideas, it's like, hey, this has kind of been vetted and there's all these people behind it. And, everybody lends that expertise from a different perspective is, that's a big part of it too. And again, that education piece, whether you're in the legislature or you're outside of it, it's, being able to explain to people, here's what's going on, here's what that looks like, and here's this fix, and this is what you would see. So there's a lot of components to it, but I would say, collaboration is a really big piece and education is a really big piece too.
That's really good. I really like the fact that you say collaboration is a really big piece, because when I think of like, creating policy or writing policy, I think of this long taxing process that I just know that I can't do by myself. So like, I would never want to go into that field. But, the fact that there's so many people contributing to the, process, it kind of like alleviates the burden. And it's not just one person thinking of everything, every word to write, it's very collaborative. So that's very encouraging.
Yeah.
So what is one of the most significant or like a highlight moment that you've had during your career in social work?
So actually, I'm going to piggyback on that collaboration piece. So I don't know that a lot of people get to say this, but whenever I was in the Senate in '86, one of the bills we got to work on was actually a bill that would improve the lives of older youth aging out of the system. And it was kind of a massive bill. It did a lot of things. And, we were trying to get some momentum behind it. Lots of groups worked on this bill and had vetted the ideas and things like that. We didn't get a lot of traction during that session, but now here I am at TexProtects, and I got to be one of the supporting partners on this bill. And we had kind of, kind of dwindled it down to the things that we felt like would be most effective for kids. And, it was really great. We got to actually see it pass this past session. So kind of getting to start the work on it while I was in the legislature and continuing to get to work on it in a different role at TexProtects was really fun. But really the big victory was for older youth, because ultimately the bill would, it would make sure that they have the documents that they need. It would, remove barriers for kids remaining in extended care. It would, just do a lot of things to make sure that kids can secure their, tuition and fee waivers, things like that. Just some really great wins for older youth. So
that's great. I like how you mentioned, something that you worked on while you were part of the 86th legislative session. It didn't seem to be going anywhere, but now you kind of see the fruit of your labor, which is like really encouraging in the field of social work, especially, we might think that our advocacy or, what we do at our job, it has no significant impact until, just give it a little time and then it might yield results. But it was really great knowing you. Now I'm going to move into the political and advocacy questions. This can be a great help to our social work students and anybody watching, because one of the primary things that we're tasked with doing as social workers is to advocate for the population. So there are so many ways to be politically engaged. What are some of the ways that you choose to remain politically engaged outside of your everyday work life?
Well, I was going to say such a big piece of it for me is the professional component. But honestly, I think a lot of the skills that I've learned in my job have helped me also personally. And so, if there's issues that, I really want to make sure that my legislator knows about, it's, reaching out to my representative, it's reaching out to the senator that represents me. I mean, they are our voice in the Capitol. And so, I would say a big piece of that is just getting involved in the legislative process. Obviously for my work, I've done some, testimony for hearings, but even just personally is, reaching out if there's an issue that I care about, whether that's an email or a phone call to my representative and senator to make sure that they know, like, hey, I want you to vote this way on a bill, or hey, I'd really like to see you advocate for this, X, Y, or Z. Another big piece that I would say, honestly, get involved in every election. Please vote. We often think like, oh yeah, we want to get involved on the big ones, like we want to do, the national level, but everything down to your local, representation is important. So I would say get out there and vote and educate yourself on who would be representing you, because that really does matter.
So voting, educating ourselves, and just, sending emails or calling our legislative bodies. That's really a good advice. So what would you say to a social work student who is nervous about getting started with political social work? Like maybe a social work student might think that getting engaged is just a big mountain that they have to climb. What would you say to put their mind at ease?
I would say, ultimately at the end of the day, your voice matters. And so, you heard me kind of mention, it's our legislators that represent us in the Capitol. And so they can't represent us well if they don't know what you want them to represent, right? And so they're people. They're people just like you and I. They want to know what's going on. They want to know what the issues are. And honestly, your voice puts a picture to whatever the issue is, right? Like, so your story matters. Going in there and being able to explain, like, hey, if this, if this bill passed, if this, whatever it is, if this budget directive were to pass, this is how it would impact me. It gives them, it kind of keeps them connected at that personal level and on the ground level of like, okay, so this is what this would look like, and here's a face that I can put with that story. So I would just say, I know it can be discouraging at times, because sometimes it just feels like we don't really put a foot forward anywhere, or sometimes it can feel like, like maybe our voice doesn't matter, but I can tell you it does. So
that's really good advice, because our representatives, they represent so many people, and they're not going to be able to know what's going on with each individual unless we speak up, unless we say something. They're going to be oblivious to maybe the struggles that we may be experiencing as individuals or as a community or as a specific population. So it's really important to know that your voice does matter. Our representatives, they're waiting to hear from us. If they don't hear from us, they have nothing to do. We have to give them work to do. That's why they're there. That's really true. Our voice doesn't matter. So if you could start all over again with political social work, what would you do a lot more of? Like, what would you do more of now that you're kind of like further down the road? What would you do a lot more of?
Probably reminding myself that things take time. I'm not a very patient person, which is kind of funny to say, especially in the job that I'm in, because, I mean, anything, whether it's legislation or things like change takes time, right? And so in general, I often say I'm not always a fan of the process. Like, I'm ready to get to the end. I'm ready to see the change. And so I think I would probably just go back, and if there was a way to just remind myself of that more, and, just like I said, just be patient with the process, and just remind myself that things take time and that every little step does count. Anytime we're moving the needle, it's important. And so I think that's what I would do more of, and hope that sticks. Yeah.
Yes, that's really good. Reminding ourselves or reminding yourself that things take time, because there's a process to everything. And we live in like a culture of like instantaneous results, the microwave culture, that's as some people call it. But just reminding ourselves that, hey, like maybe we're doing this today, it won't yield results for the next 5 years, but it's still our responsibility to do what we can do today in order to see those results in the next 5 years. So that's really good, reminding ourselves that things take time. So I know you shared one of your success stories with us already, but I don't know if you have another one. In your personal pursuits, in what ways have you seen your engagement in politics yield results in your area of practice?
Well, I mean, I think, like I said, it's sometimes kind of hard for me to differentiate the personal and professional, right? Because the personal in me also really cares about child protection issues. And so, I think I would just say, yielding results is just, I think, like I said, I gave the story about the bill that, we helped pass, and, things like that. I would say also, anytime that you see kind of legislators get it, you know what I mean? Like, you can see how, like, you sharing a certain story, or how you educated them on something, how it's like, okay, so they get it now. I mean, think about it. We expect legislators to be the experts on so many topics. And so I think sometimes even just little conversations that we have where it's like, hey, we were able to break down this really complicated thing and help them understand the issue, or potentially even change their mind, right? Like, I think that's, I would say that is something that, just even those little moments kind of remind me of why I do what I do, right?
Yeah. That is definitely a win, seeing legislators get it, because like you said, they can be such a complicated issue, and they're so far removed from the issue where they like, it seems so abstract to them, just like bringing it to their forefront. That's definitely a good win, because sometimes like we might be like watching TV and we're so frustrated at like our president or like our mayor because they don't get a certain situation. But like you said, you being that position that you have been in, you were able to like, allow or help the legislative representatives get it, which is a really good win.
Yeah.
So we're going to take some recommendations from you since you've been a social worker for a while. What's the number one website that helps social work students with political social work or advocacy, and how does it help?
So I would say, first and foremost, if you have not checked out the Texas legislature online, that is where I would go. It is more of an informational tool. So, I mean, they're not going to necessarily give you like tips or things like that, but the reason why I think it's probably the most important one for like legislative advocacy is because it makes sure that you are in the know of what's out there. It's somewhere you can go to know what bills have been filed, who's filed them. It's a place you can go to know where it is in the legislative process. It gives great summaries when they've had hearings, different things like that, or how much the bill costs to do to implement. There's just so much on there, and how to contact people on a committee and who's part of which committees. It even, if you're not sure who represents you, that's where you can go and type in your address and find out, all the way down, down the scale, like who represents you locally, who represents you at the state level, nationally, you name it. So I just think as far as like just kind of being in the know, that is definitely one, like I would say, the go-to website for legislative matters. I do want to make another little plug since we've talked about my organization. We have some great webinars on our website. So if you go to like TexProtects.org, we have two off the top of my head. We have one that's literally how bills become laws. And it kind of takes you through that process. It kind of gives you some like little bit of insight into like why things are important and who you can contact. And we also have another one about like how to engage in the process. And we actually involve some legislative staff to kind of give that like inside tips and tricks for how to get involved. So I would say if you're actually looking for like, okay, literally what's the next step or how can I do this well, I would check out those webinars as well.
Thank you. So Texas Legislative Online.
Texas Legislature Online. If you just type that into Google, some people call it TLO, but yeah, it's got a really long name. But if you type in Texas Legislature Online, it'll come up on Google.
Texas Legislator Online and TexProtects.org are two great, resources that we as social workers can use to better, advocate for our communities. And I really like Texas Legislator Online. The way you described it, it seems like it's really informative, especially when there's so many bills being passed at so many times. It's hard to just, keep track of it all. So I'm definitely going to be checking out that website. And I have one last question for you. How do you manage information overload in a society that overloads us with so much information?
That is a really great question. Well, I think first and foremost, I'm not sure which direction you're going with that question, but I would say one is let yourself unplug at times, because I think, obviously there's so many news outlets, always things going on. There's always ways that you can get information of all sorts. So I would say give yourself permission to unplug every once in a while. That's kind of the first thing I would say. But also, I think, also be content with what you were able to find. So like as a policy person, first of all, I'm very just my personality, I'm very thorough. I want to know all of the things all of the time. I can't. And so I think sometimes just being able to say like, okay, I did some research, this is what I found, and being content with that, because there's always going to be different rabbit holes you can go down. So I think just being able to say, okay, I feel good about what I know. And if anybody's got a question, I can always say, hey, I don't have that answer for you. I can come back and look something up for you. But the expectation is not that you know all of the details all of the time. So I would say kind of, depending on where you're going with that, those would be how I'd answer that.
Yeah, that really helps, allowing yourself to unplug, give yourself permission to unplug and be content with what you know. Like, I don't think I've heard that one yet. And I think that's a really good one because, our minds, like we always want to know more, like you said, and anything can lead to a rabbit hole. And then here we are 3 a.m, still on our computers.
Right.
And we're wondering why we're so overloaded with information. It's because we weren't content. So I really like that. Be content with what you know. Thank you, Kerrie, for spending time with me today. Thank you to all of our listeners for joining us for another episode of Social Work Amplified. I hope you were able to learn something today that empowers you to become more politically engaged and helps you shape a better tomorrow. Until next time.